Welcome back. Let's do a quick review of where we've come so far. We've had a Socratic discussion of a children's story that focused on two of the three common elements that all stories share: context and style. And what we did was we read a children's story and then, using questions from the Socratic list, had a discussion of context and style. I hope you can see two things going on there. Number one, as a parent and teacher, you can use those Socratic questions to teach yourself about the importance of context and style, how they work together to help an author emphasize his themes. But at the same time, I hope you can see that those very same Socratic questions can be used in a class with your students to teach them the same concepts. The Socratic questions are designed to be a tool that you can, in other words, learn and teach simultaneously. I want to continue that process now as we begin to look at the structural elements that all stories have in common. We've talked about context, we've talked about style. Let's proceed now and talk about structure. So, the structural elements of a story are graphically represented on your story chart. We talked about the story chart a little bit in a previous session, but I want you to take a look at it again now. Notice that there are 5 structural elements represented on the story chart that all stories have in common: conflict and plot, setting and characters, and theme there in the center. The rest of our time together is going to be focused primarily on understanding these 5 structural elements, how they work together, how to identify them, and how to talk about them, how to discuss them with your students, so that all of you come to an understanding of literary art and how an author uses these structural elements to tell his story. We're going to begin by looking at setting for just a few minutes. But before I do, I want to make clear that the order in which you address these structural elements is not as important as the discussion that you have as a result. Sometimes, depending on the story that you're reading and trying to understand, the setting will be a really good place to start, for a couple of reasons that I'll make clear in a minute. Other times, however, you may want to begin with characters. You may want to begin with conflict. Perhaps the plot of a story jumps right out at you and you want to start by discussing that. It's up to you. You should use this story chart and you should use the idea of the structure of a story for your own purposes, the goal being a good Socratic discussion of ideas. Your students should not serve your curriculum, is what I'm trying to say. Your curriculum should serve your students. And however deep and however complete and however exhaustive a treatment you want to give of a particular story, as long as it serves the goal of a good Socratic discussion, you win. If you want to do a much shorter discussion that covers only a few of the structural elements, that's perfectly fine, as long as a good Socratic discussion of ideas results. So, with that as an introduction, let's go ahead and begin talking about this structural element, setting. What is the setting of a story? We talked a little bit earlier about the definition of the term, the details of the time and place in which a story occurs, right? That's the simple definition of setting. And you can ask a very simple question about setting, or in fact, those two very simple questions. Where does this story happen? When does this story happen? It turns out, however, that some follow-up questions from those two basic ones can lead a discussion in some pretty profound directions. So let's take a look at the Socratic list, and in particular at the questions that deal with setting. Let's see if we can't acquire some tools for a deeper, more profound discussion. Socratic list question 1 is the simple version of the place question of setting. Where does this story happen? I want you to notice that that question is in bold-faced type in your Socratic list. Question number 1, where does this story happen? And I want you to notice that it's followed by 9 or 10 sub-questions or follow-up questions. In what country or region does the story take place? Does the story happen in the country or the city? Does the story happen in one spot, or does the action unfold across a wide area? What is the mood or atmosphere of the place where the story happens? Is it cheerful and sunny? Is it dark and bleak? What words or phrases or descriptions does the author use to create this atmosphere? Notice how, as we go down this list of sub-questions, the questions are getting slightly more involved, slightly more subtle, slightly more profound. What's the weather like in this story? Do you long to climb into the pages of the story and live in its world, or does it repel you? Why do you have this reaction? What is the author doing with his words and his ideas that's creating this reaction in you? Look down at the end of the list of sub-questions for question number 1. Is the setting of the story important because of historical events which may have taken place there? How does this link help you understand the themes of the story? Notice how that last sub-question is appropriate for an older student. An adult reading a story would have a good time thinking and talking about that last question. In fact, all of the questions on the Socratic list are arranged in this way. The bold-faced main question is designed to be used with very young students or designed for a very cursory initial analysis of the story. And then the sub-questions that follow increase in complexity as you go down the list. This is a really important principle because this means you can use the Socratic list with students of every age. It's never necessary to use all of the questions and their sub-questions for a discussion of setting. You're going to pick and choose from the list based on the story that you're reading, based on the age of your students, based on the maturity level of your students, based on the attention span of your students, based on how much discussion you feel like you can get in today before you have to go do something else or the kids start looking out the window and throwing brickbats at each other. So the Socratic questions and the Socratic list are there to serve you and for you to pick and choose from based on the discussion that you want to have. Look at question 2, which also deals with setting. When does this story happen? There's the basic one. There's the elementary level one. There's the one you could ask of a lap sitter to whom you've just read the story out loud. On what day does the story happen? What time of day? Is this important to the story's themes? Is it important that the story happens in the afternoon instead of the morning? You'd be surprised how often the answer is yes. Remember, authors choose their settings very, very carefully. There's nothing accidental or haphazard about the setting of a story. I'll say more than that. An author chooses his setting so as to emphasize his themes. Don't forget this, an author is always emphasizing his theme. He's always making a point. Every facet of his story is designed to illustrate, emphasize his theme. Even the setting, even these details that you might think are unimportant. Look at question D under 2. 2D. Does the story happen in a particular year, era, or age of the world? What historical events may have just preceded the period of the story? Do these events help explain the actions of characters, the actions of the story, or its mood in some way? This question asks the student to recall details from his other studies, to combine his understanding of literature with his understanding of history, for example, and to set this story and its events in a larger context of historical events and time periods. This is logical for us to do, a logical question for us to ask, because the author put his story in that time period on purpose, and those links are ones that he invites you to make. And these kinds of Socratic questions can get your students thinking about those links and therefore understanding the story more deeply. So I want you to use questions 1 and 2 from the Socratic list every time you go to discuss the setting of a story with your students. Don't forget, it is not necessary that you discuss the setting of a story every time you discuss a book. It's not necessary that you begin with setting. What I'm saying is, when it comes time to talk about the setting of a story, use the Socratic questions here to get your discussion started.